Welcome to Marrakesh. Welcome to the Policy Center for the New South. Welcome to Atlantic Dialogue in Marrakesh. I welcome today the former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Jorge Castañeda. Mr. Castañeda, we are facing in Europe migration which is creating movements in Germany, in France, in Holland, anti-immigration, populism, and right-wing governments. How to avoid this kind of masses of migration coming? Because you have experience in Mexico, the border. How do you stop the flow, you in Mexico?
Well, first of all, I think the important thing is to acknowledge that except in the very long term, you cannot stop the flow. You have to manage the flow. You have to humanize the flow. You have to legalize the flow, but you cannot stop it except in the long term. And the long term depends how long it is. For example, the flows from Spain and Portugal and Italy in the 1950s and 60s to the north of Europe stopped by the 1980s. But they stopped because these countries joined the European Economic Community, as it was called back then, because a lot of money was sent by Brussels and Germany and France to the south, because they carried out a number of reforms, because the flows were legalized completely. So in the same sense today, yes, you have to find a way, the Europeans and the Americans, and to a lesser extent, a country like Mexico, we have to administer, manage the flow, but stop thinking that we can stop it.
I totally agree, but then you start humanize, meaning what? Legalize, meaning what? There is a policy in Mexico and a policy in the United States on immigration, but it doesn't work.
Well, it doesn't work because it hasn't been reformed. Remember, the last immigration reform in the United States was in 1986. Ronald Reagan was president.
We were children.
We were children, and most people hadn't been born. So, the United States system is broken, and consequently, Mexico's situation is very difficult, if not untenable. The United States has to increase enormously the number of people that they accept in legally, because they need
people on
labor
the farms.
force from on the farms, in the restaurants, to take care of the elderly, to build everything that Biden wants, to build America back, build his infrastructure, his IRA plan. He needs enormous amounts of manpower to do that. Much of it is unskilled and low wage. Americans aren't always willing to do that. The United States needs enormous amounts of labor from abroad. And there are enormous amounts of people in Mexico, in the Caribbean, in Central America, and parts of South America who are willing to do those jobs. It's a win-win situation. The problem is the United States Congress that doesn't want to legislate a de facto situation.
But how does Mexico, where it flows and flows and millions possibly by now are sitting waiting for process into the United States, how does Mexico deal with that?
We deal with it very poorly. We are doing the Americans' dirty work for them, and we're doing it for nothing. At least Turkey and Erdogan asked the British, not the British, the Europeans and mainly the Germans, basically, it was Angela Merkel who paid 6 billion euros. This is a lot of money. And I'm not saying that the Syrian and Afghan refugees in Turkey are in wonderful shape,
no,
but at least they're in better shape than the people from Central America and the Caribbean who are sitting on the Mexican part of the border with the United States in squalid conditions, prey for all of the cartels and organized crime, being constantly shaken down or murdered by the Mexican authorities. There were 40 Venezuelan migrants who were burned alive in a migration station in Ciudad Juarez. 40, one go, burned alive, incinerated. So the first thing Mexico has to do is to stop doing the Americans' dirty work. Secondly, get the Americans to pay for this. And thirdly, legalize all these people while they are in Mexico so that they can get a job. Some of them will want to stay. Most will not. They will prefer to go to the United States. Okay, but let them work in Mexico while they are in Mexico.
Aren't the countries like San Salvador, Guatemala, and all these people, neighbors, unable because they have no money, or because they have no desire to stop these people, or they just can't manage?
Well, you know, it's very difficult. I mean, you can see it with the countries in the Sahel, and you can see it with Libya, and you could see it before with Turkey. It's very difficult to stop your own nationals from leaving. First of all, it's against the law.
Yes.
No country allows its own government to stop people from leaving. Only East Germany did it.
Yes.
And
they didn't succeed all the time either.
It didn't work very well.
No.
And that's over, thank God. So you can't have that done. People, if they want to leave, they will leave. And you can't ask any government to stop its people from leaving. The Cubans can do it, but that's another dictatorship.
And it's a far go to come to the United States by boat also.
But it's, you know, it's complicated. What you can do is create the conditions in the long term so that they don't want to leave. But some of these things increasingly are out of your hands. Climate change in Central America is becoming one of the most important factors in
no water.
Pushing.
No water.
No water or hurricanes. Okay. And hurricanes. The two, it's climate change in general.
Destroying agriculture, destroying
Absolutely.
the land.
This clearly has been a driving factor in Honduran migration. In the case of Honduras, it's categorical. In many parts of the highlands in Guatemala, it's very much so.
That's almost survival, self-survival, that they leave. Because if they stay, they die.
They die.
Yeah. So the problem we have in Europe, you mentioned Libya. You know, the people who leave there all the time, they're unstoppable also because the Europeans pay the Libyans, and there are people leaving. The Europeans pay Morocco, and people are leaving. So what do you do to stop them?
You
I mean, you said there is no stopping.
There is no stopping.
But how do you slow it down?
Well, you slow it down by, first of all, legalizing it, which means people are willing to wait if they're in a reasonable amount of time, they're called. But it has to be in a reasonable amount of time. If you tell them wait 20 years, they will cross the sea. They will risk it. They will risk crossing the river in Mexico and crossing the Mediterranean here. If you tell them wait a year, wait 2 years, wait 3 years.
And how do they survive?
Well, you have this issue, and so you have to have the OIM and you have to have UNHCR when you have an ambiguous situation, because it's also very important. The traditional rules of what is asylum, what is violence of a non-war situation, what is climate change, and what is purely economic migration, those apparently separate categories are more and more conflated with each other.
And how do you choose what is what?
You have to rewrite a lot of the rules. Remember, for example, most of the rules regarding asylum, the UN conventions date from the late 40s, early 50s. This is soon, 75 years ago. Things have happened in the world in between.
That's for sure.
We have an outdated international legal structure for these things. What is a person in Honduras whose land has been flooded, whose family has been raped by organized crime, and who has low wages? Is that person an economic migrant, a victim of climate change, or persecuted by the gangs, by the Mara Salvatrucha?
Yes.
Does he have a fear of persecution? Does he fear for his life?
And
yes,
he's
he does.
Right. Yes,
he's right. Yes, he does. Now, there's no army bombing him. There's no Air Force bombing his home. It's the gangs. Is that a less justified fear of persecution or fear for their life.
But how do you define this? If you would still be Minister of Foreign Affairs, how would you define that?
First of all, I think it has to be defined internationally and regionally. The same way we have the conventions regarding asylum, regarding refugees, we have all of that. We have to redefine many of the categories because they are no longer applicable.
Right.
We tried, for example, in the case of Latin America, through a thing called the Cartagena Protocol, to include internal violence, not necessarily of a civil war.
San Salvador.
It could be, it could be a civil war, but it could also be violence by gangs, or even domestic violence. How do you tell a woman who has been beaten up by her husband or partner 20 times, every time he gets drunk and comes home and beats the hell out of her, how do you tell her that she doesn't have a reasonable fear for her life? She does.
But it's a very large, if you argue that, you can say, where do we start and where do we stop?
It's large, although in our case, in this case of Latin America, or Central America and the Caribbean plus Ecuador, that's about it. Now, Venezuela is a special case. That's a very, very special case.
And there are hundreds of thousands.
7 million have left. But that is an aberration. But mostly it's Central America, the Caribbean, and Ecuador, a little bit Venezuela. The United States is a country of 330 million people.
So you mean the figure is not that tough for them?
It's not that much. I mean, so why can't they take in? They take in about 1 million a year of refugees, temporary workers, permanent change of status, etc. Why not 2 million?
Just tell me.
Why not 3 million? What's the big deal?
Final question. Our friend Mr. Trump, if he comes back to power,
it would be a disaster.
He would say, we built the wall 10 miles. Isn't that bullshit?
Yes, of course it is. Of course it is. It just costs money and it doesn't do any good. But the problem is not the wall. The problem are the deportations. The problem are the raids to round people up and throw them out. Because this time, if he's elected, he will have no limits. There will be no
new elections.
No new election for him to be careful with. He will do everything he wants, and he's completely with extremely radical positions.
That's a very nice way of putting it.
Let's leave it at very radical.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nice talking to you.
As always.
Thank you.
Great.